After Abraham Lincoln, this gentleman's name, his face, the stories about him have come to symbolize the American Civil War. When we see pictures of generals or commanders from this conflict, this man is almost always among the first of the list. Today we are talking about Robert Edward Lee, Robert E. Lee, as he is often called, and we will be answering 4 of Google's suggested search questions about this Confederate commander and his role and influence in the American Civil War. I'm Sarah Kay Bierle with GZ665, and today we are answering Google's 4 suggested search questions about Robert E. Lee. Question number 1. What did Robert E. Lee believe in? Now this is an interesting question, and it's kind of similar to one that came up when we did this searched and answered session on Jefferson Davis. And I'm not exactly sure where the question is coming from, but I'm guessing it probably has to do with what did Lee believe about causes of the Civil War. So I borrowed a book from the library. It is a great, big, ginormous book, and it is called The Wartime Papers of Robert E. Lee. So I was combing through the index, looking at some things, and then following up with other research files that I have. What did Lee believe? Trying to figure out a condensed answer to this question that is coming up in the suggested searches. So, first off, let's talk a little bit about slavery. In a December 1862 letter to one of his sons, Robert E. Lee wrote that he saw slavery and the slavery that he had inherited and kind of become a part of at the Arlington plantation as an unpleasant legacy. So Lee was not a Southerner in favor of slavery. It is a culture that he has been raised with, and yet he did not see it as something that was necessarily worth fighting to preserve. He does not list slavery as a reason that he would personally be fighting in the Civil War. Yes, he fights for the Confederacy, which has obviously strong ties to slavery and that issue, but Lee himself did not necessarily see that as one of his compelling reasons for. Having briefly mentioned that, where can we get an idea of why Lee sides with Virginia, sides with the Confederacy in the Civil War? And as I was looking at quotes and thinking about how to answer this question and try to keep it short, I kept coming back to what he writes at the beginning of the conflict in April 1861. And his acceptance speech when he accepts command of Virginia's forces in April 1861 in Richmond, I think sets a groundwork that then he continues to build upon and follow through during the next 4 years of the conflict. And I'll quote partially from his acceptance speech. Deeply impressed with the solemnity of the occasion on which I appear before you, and profoundly grateful for the honor conferred upon me, I accept the position your partiality has assigned me, though I would greatly have preferred your choice to have fallen on one more capable. Trusting to Almighty God, and approving conscience, and the aid of my fellow citizens, I will devote myself to the defense and service of my native state, in whose behalf alone would I have ever drawn my sword. And this comes back to Lee's resounding belief in states' rights. He is going to follow Virginia, and he saw Virginia, his home state, as the entity that had more allegiance from him than the federal government. A couple of other things that really kind of stand out to me in this speech that Lee makes is he is not going to be one of the leaders in the southern states that is constantly angling and pushing himself forward and trying to promote himself. He actually sees himself at this point in 1861 as maybe not quite the right one to command, but he's going to give it a try and trust that the citizenry of Virginia will rally with him in this defense of their state as the Civil War is beginning. And I think in some ways we see these sort of themes carrying through. Lee is fighting with this idea of Virginia, and that plays a big role in how he fights his battles, how he fights his campaigns, some of his planning, his strategy, sometimes even certain commanders that he trusts more than others, maybe stemming from those Virginia roots. Question number 2. What battles did Robert E. Lee win? I really love this question, so I'm going to list off a few of them. We're not going to go super in-depth on them because we'll probably do a searched and answered on a lot of Civil War battles, hopefully next year in 2020. So here we go. Battles that Robert E. Lee won. 7 days battles around Richmond, summer of 1862. Second Battle of Manassas, August 1862. He fights a battle, the Battle of Antietam, Battle of Sharpsburg, that will end in a draw, if we will, militarily. The Union's going to claim the victory because Lee falls back, but Lee holds his own and actually holds position on the day of fighting. So we won't actually put that on his victory list, but it's worth mentioning because he holds his own on a difficult day of fighting. Battle of Fredericksburg is going to be a victory for him. That's December of 1862. Battle of Chancellorsville, May 1863. Gettysburg, not a victory there. Just throwing it in there because for those that are like, Gettysburg? No. Just in case you didn't know, Lee does not win Gettysburg. The Overland Campaign happens in 1864, and Lee will hold position and then retreat, hold position and then retreat. So we can go back and forth on whether those count as victories. Personally, I would not count them as victories at this point in my research, because even if he's holding a position, he's not ultimately able to regain an offensive, and he retreats after each battle in that campaign. So pretty much the way I see it, Lee's major victories are going to be the 7 days, Second Manassas, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. Those are his big and major victories. So if you're taking notes and want a little more to research, there's a starting point. Question number 3. Why was General Robert E. Lee important? I think it's interesting how the suggested search question is phrased here. They actually put general in there. So I think they're kind of asking in a military sense, why was Lee important? Or at least that's how I'm going to choose to interpret it. Robert E. Lee is important because he commanded the Confederacy's Army of Northern Virginia. In the military sense, that is why he is so important during the American Civil War. The Army of Northern Virginia successfully holds off Union attacks, campaigns, and Army raids and advances on Richmond, which is capital of the Confederacy, for years. And much of that is due to Lee and then his commanders, his subordinates in the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee is also important because he is trusted by the Confederate executive branch and the Confederate War Department. Other Confederate commanders, particularly those in the Western Theater, did not always have the same levels of success or the same levels of trust that Lee enjoyed with the Confederate government in Richmond. I would venture to say that militarily, Lee was also important because he gains this reputation of being a general that is very hard to defeat. When Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general who will eventually defeat Lee on the battlefields and in campaign, first comes east to Virginia, there was this saying among the Union soldiers, well, he may have won in the West, but he hasn't gone up against Bobby Lee or Robert E. Lee. The soldiers had all kinds of nicknames for him. So Lee becomes this legend, even during the war and during his lifetime. And there was the idea that he was difficult to defeat. Of course, we know Lee eventually does get defeated, and he will end up surrendering the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. But even after the war, Lee has this legacy and this influence, and he tried to use it for good as the South and Virginia was going through the Reconstruction period. That's a whole nother discussion for a whole nother day. But even after his death, Lee has remained this figure usually associated with undefeat or heroics or things like that, and much of that stems from what became his battlefield and military legacy. Question number 4. What were Robert E. Lee's last words? This is an interesting question. It kind of surprised me when it came up in the suggested questions. But it's a good one. And perhaps it stems from the idea that Thomas J. Jackson, or Stonewall Jackson's last words are so famous. And everyone kind of goes, well, what did Lee say when he was on his deathbed and in his final moments? So, here's the story and the details. On October 12th, 1870, Robert E. Lee dies. So there's 5 years after 1865 when the war ends. And Lee's final words were, "Strike the tent, tell Hill he must come up." So he reverts to military memories, and that comes into these final words that he murmurs on his deathbed. And of course there's been speculation on what he could have been thinking. We obviously don't really know. Strike the tent is an order for moving forward, getting ready to march. It's breaking down the place where you either spent the night or spent the winter or spent the week waiting for the campaign to begin. So it's this idea of moving forward, something that he was definitely familiar with from all of his years in the military, all the way back into 1840s, Mexican-American War, when he's doing campaigning there, and obviously the Civil War as well. Now, his second statement, "Tell Hill he must come up." This is probably referring to his general A.P. Hill. Hill was one of Lee's corps commanders, so this seems to be a definite reference back to Civil War days and perhaps Civil War memories. So ultimately, we don't know what Lee was thinking, but those were his final words, which he spoke on October 12th, 1870, and those were going to be his final comments in this life. Well, folks, those are our 4 suggested search questions from the Google Internet Search Engine, and we've had a short discussion on Robert E. Lee. Of course, there's always more to say. Perhaps there's questions that you have that you'd like me to take a stab at and bring some historical documents or facts to the discussion. So if you have some questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments on the YouTube channel or in the blog post that will also be sharing this video. That's going to wrap it up for today, and we will be back next week to talk about the famous Union general that Lee had to surrender to in 1865. We'll let you take a guess at that if you don't already know who it is. I'm Sarah Kay Bierle with GZ665, and thanks for joining me for this discussion and searched and answered episode about Robert E. Lee. Have a wonderful and inspired week, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.